Morning, everyone. Sorry about canceling class, but I tried to get down the hill at my house and it was impossible. So, no reason to put anyone in danger when we can make do with a video lecture and online. So, you should have read or should be reading Trained by Alice Munro. Munro is considered probably the most famous Canadian contemporary short story writer. She's won a ton of awards, and she's almost unread in America, which makes it even that much more interesting. One of her biggest focal points happens to be memory, and whether or not we can trust a narrative that's based on memory. So think about a memory you might have and then think about how someone else might interpret the same incident. So a great example is, my sister and I, some of you have heard this story, my sister and I, when we were younger, she's 7 years younger than me, we went to a concert where the intrepid Curtin stands, and she was positive, and still to this day is positive, that we saw The Cure. I am positive, and actually right, that we saw U2. And our memories of the actual event were pretty similar, but then there were those little things like who's playing, pretty big thing, where, and when, and basically how we got home, which is a whole nother story. So our memories are really unique unto us, and as such, we have to acknowledge that they can be faulty. So let's just talk about narrators, and then we'll go a little bit deeper. So I apologize for looking off to my right. It's only because of the fact that my notes are there. So, okay, so there are certain types of narrators that we see almost all the time, either in, I'm really only talking about fiction here. So there's the first person narrator who is the I. So they're speaking from usually their personal perspective, and they can be a character in the story. They tend to interact with the other characters, and any of those interactions we see through their eyes. So basically they're manipulating the story. We're not going to learn anything they don't want us to learn. And a lot of writers use this because it's a great tool to actually really create a narrative that is personal. Of course, the problem with the first person is that the story I tell you could be very different than the story that actually occurred. And you always have to question whether or not I'm telling you the truth. Does it matter? Maybe, maybe not. I think that's perspective, but it's important to recognize that we could be reading something that's not true. And when we get to the book, you'll start to see the different perspectives. Third person is the narrative we usually see. And the third person narrative is the we, he, she, they. The key with this is that the narrator really is the fly in the wall or the observer of all of the action around them. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read, sometimes as I'm reading, I think, who is the person telling the story? Where are they standing? What's their perspective visually? How do they know the people they're talking about? We don't really think about that because we're reading the narrative and we just think everything is the way it's supposed to be. But you really have to recognize that the third person is out there somewhere. So they may be what's called omniscient, and omniscient is someone a narrator who tells every side of the story. Or it could be focalized where the story's only told through one character's vision. When we start to read the book, we're going to see that it's third person with multi-narrative perspectives or omniscient perspectives. Now let's look at the kind of exceptions. So one of the biggest exceptions is second person. Second person is rarely used because it's so difficult to do correctly. Basically, it's using the you, and so the you is where you're actually engaging with the reader. So you're saying to the reader, you know who really did this, right? As if the reader is in on whatever secret you're telling them. Important things to remember is that just because the author's writing through the eyes of the narrative does not mean that the author is the narrator. So you can actually pick someone to narrate your story who's totally fictional, who's not you, and who in no way resembles you. Reality is that most authors rely on what they know, so usually it's someone that has similarities to the author. Okay. With third person narratives, you're really trusting the perspective of the narrator. Note I didn't say author, but the narrator. When the narrator is first person and they're really an essential part of the story, you tend to get a better sense of their character and who they are and their traits and what's important. So it's really important to start to look at this. As you start to write and read, you really want to sort of start to jot down or brainstorm clues about, you know, who is the narrator, what voice do they have, what manipulation is going on, what might be true and what might be false, and does that matter to the storyline? Now, Munro plays a lot with the unreliable narrator, and that really is a narrator we absolutely can't trust. So when does that happen? Well, it happens when someone's talking about an incident that's a memory, because our memories are faulty. I'm going to put up later on a TED video that shows you, you know, what happens with mistaken identity cases. And, you know, it's very, very common to have mistaken identity cases where a witness comes in and actually fingers someone for the crime who didn't do it. And it's because the memory, you know, memories go, right? You know, there are days if you ask me to remember what I did in the morning, good luck. So always think about that. Now, unreliable narrators are usually narrators who have some intent to manipulate. So that's really their intent throughout the story, is to kind of fool with us. They have potentially some kind of disorder that causes some kind of mental issue. So sometimes if you see a narrator, that recently we've had a lot of narrators with autism. Now, autism makes people hypersensitive, but it also means that we don't necessarily know always what's true, what's fictional. Unreliable narrators really can be anyone we can't trust, but that said, it really has to be obvious. So you really want to see a narrator who, from the outset of the book, is sending us down the wrong pathway. As you really start to look at these, you really want to consider the following questions. Is the narrator telling us, writing, everything he or she knows? Are they leaving things out? And usually, as people, human beings leave things out because we want what we want. And sometimes, or most of the time, we're apt not to deliver everything because it may work against us. The next thing you have to consider is, are there any limits that the narrator may have in terms of perception? So does the narrator have a concussion? Does the narrator have a history of abuse? What are those things that make our perceptions faulty? And if we're honest with one another, we all have faulty perceptions. And then finally, why do you think the narrator's telling us this story? Stories have meaning. So what is the meaning behind the story is going to be really important and something we need to look at. Munro in particular has a lot of her stories focus on these distinct memories, and a lot of times we can't sort of parcel out what the narrator really wants out of us. So as you're reading, try and really start to think about that. You're going to have an assignment on memory. It does not have to be a formal essay. It should be about 500 words. Really be honest with yourself, because it's really a personal narrative that you're delivering. It's only between you and me, so it's private. If you have any problems with it, email me or text me and I'll get back to you. So you should be finishing through Munro today, and then moving on to the next module, the next reading section. So basically Munro's gonna finish out the first section, and then we're gonna move into the second section of short stories. So really try to get yourself finished with the Munro section and move on to the next session for next week. Okay, I will hopefully see you guys soon.